Chi-Town. Yeah.
Drama.
What?
Purchase your tracks today.
Saludos. Gabe Morales back here to bring you another video on one of the better known gangs in America and the biggest Latino gang in Chicago. Due to time, I cannot cover all of their history, but I will at least mention some of them. And again, I do not intend to glorify this group or any others that I've covered in the past. As a reminder, this channel covers issues that directly affect police and community, and that includes gangs. I have personally dealt with several Latin kings at the King County Jail in Seattle that came from Chicago. There are not a lot in the Seattle area, so they're not a major factor. But I've spoken to enough to get some details about their, as they put it, organization. In addition to interviewing them, I've spoke to many gang cops who arrested kings in Chicago and other parts of the Midwest. And I always get differences of opinion, which is okay by me. There are seldom absolutes when dealing with any subject. So let me say this up front. Again, there are always exceptions. If you are or were a king once out there, this video may not totally be your truth, but it is my truth to the best of my knowledge. I try to get a consensus when dealing with any subject, in this case, gangs. So let me tell you what I know based on my direct experiences, conversations with cops and gangsters, and relay some of the evidence-based research I've uncovered. One thing I've recognized, and in particular with this group, is many people want to lump various factions of a gang together. And in this case, to lump all the Latin kings together is a mistake. Chicago is the motherland, but even from its beginnings, this organization has constantly evolved and is still evolving. Although there are kings in other parts of the country, indeed, all over the world, the motherland only recognizes kings that have been blessed by them. Some kings are considered renegades, even in Chicago. And even in recognized sections, you had a South King and a North King. There are some kings, depending on where they live in Chicago, who are mostly Mexican or Mexican Americans. And as one of our commenters pointed out, the word Chicano never caught on like it did in places like Calipas. That would be California for you novices. Other king areas were mostly Puerto Rican or Boricuas, as many like to be called. Also, it is important to note that the Milwaukee Kings are not to be confused with the Latin Kings. The Milwaukee name comes from Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago. They descended from a group called the Young Horsemen. I will briefly cover them in my next Chicago Latino Gangs video. But maybe to make it even more confusing, there are some Latin kings operating within the city of Milwaukee. I've heard some people say the kings started in the 1940s as the Latin Angels. I don't know about that, but I do know the origins are debated even today. Some say they were founded in 1954 by Ramon Popo Santos in or near the West Side Wicker Park in South Lawndale, to be exact. Ramon Santos, later known as King Popo, moved to Levitt and Schiller, located very close to Albert R. Sabin School on West Hirsch Street. It is currently a dual language magnet school and located just a few blocks east of Wicker Park. But there is no hard evidence that Santos started this group in 1954. More than likely, some got that date wrong. In fact, by about 10 years. I find the date of 1964 to be more accurate. Let me explain why. Also, as I stated in the SD video, the Satan's disciples are documented as having been founded in 1959 and were definitely up and running by very early 1960. So if the king started in 1964, the Satan's disciples could not have started because of a threat by the Latin kings. I hope that makes sense. But it is a documented fact, if one is to look at changing demographics in Chicago by U.S. Census and by citywide data, starting in the mid-1950s, many Puerto Rican families fled the near West Side in Old Town neighborhoods when the Carl Sandburg Village was built over the La Carte neighborhood, which was a predominantly Puerto Rican settlement. La Clark, as well as another Puerto Rican area, La Madison, began to clear out in 1961. When both Puerto Rican and Mexican families were evicted from their previous housing, they had to move to other affordable areas of Chicago. Many of the Puerto Ricans moved to the Wicker Park, East Village, and East and West Humboldt Park areas. One must understand that Chicago, for many years, and even some areas outside of Chicago, like Cicero, were very segregated. This new wave of Latinos angered much of the elder white population, and they often taught their children who ran in youth clubs, better known as gangs, to act racist towards the Latinos. In fact, racial hatred is one of the main reasons for gangs all over America. The ironic thing is, as I've brought up many times, is while many of these groups are said to have initially started for protection of their people, almost all race-based gangs mostly prey on their own people. It should also be noted that the Kings and most other race-based gangs would take in white kids, but that individual usually identified more with his adopted gang than a gang of his own race. In other words, he had to be more Latino than the Latinos. A good example of this would be Joe Morgan from East LA, the honorary godfather of the California Mexican Mafia. He had no Mexican or Latino blood in him, but he spoke better Spanish than me. And when I escorted him into the violence control unit of New Folsom, he was celled up with a Mexican national that hardly spoke any English. It didn't matter. Papa Joe was very fluent in Spanish, as well as Calo, which is Chicano slang. Hispanic youth in Chicago were often also bullied by large black gangs like the Clovers, Imperial Chaplains, and Egyptian Cobras. There are also several Hispanic groups like the Young Sinners, Young Lords, Spanish Kings, and Scorpions, who were soon taken over by Latin disciples, as I described in the MLD video. First Street Lords, Latin Angels, who existed prior to the Markings or Latin Kings, the Paragons, and Skulls, all formed before or around 1962. As these new groups formed, the Imperials gang made the decision to begin recruiting young members, starting a new generation of Imperials, bringing in legendary members like Jose Cadillac Joe Rivera, for example. This name selection of Imperials likely angered pre-existing black gangs like the Imperial Chaplains. This new wave of Latin Imperials were posted at Kinsey in Ohio in the southern part of West Humboldt Park, as well as Leavitt and Schiller in Wicker Park. The Skulls were a very prominent Puerto Rican gang in the East Village neighborhood and were based at Chicago Avenue and Noble in Eckerd Park. At about the same time, as I mentioned in the Ambrose video and other videos, many Mexican families had to relocate from Chicago's Little Italy in the near West Side due to the construction of the new University of Illinois at Chicago campus expansion, as well as the construction of nearby interstate freeways. As I explained in a previous video, the Ambrose gang existed as early as 1960, and it fought with a Puerto Rican gang called the Royal Kings. The Royals operated in a number of areas at the time and hung out at a snack shop near Loomis and Fillmore, as well as other areas. Now, I've heard some say that these Royal Kings were the ancestors of the Reyes Latinos, who preceded the Latin Kings. In 1962, there was a creation of a gang of Mexican youth called the Mark Kings, who are formed at the intersection of 24th and Marshall Boulevard in the Marshall Square section of South Mondale. Mark Kings comes from the street name of Marshall, thus Mar, and it was basically created to say that they were kings of the boulevard, Marshall Boulevard Kings, or Markings for short. The Markings grew slowly from a half a dozen to 15 to perhaps as many as 30 members, fought rivals such as the Gaylords, which is a white gang that still has some active members today in Chicago. The Markings became active in the Newberry and Roosevelt section in the near West Side neighborhood, and their Pee-wee set were called the Little Markings. These Markings, both seniors and juniors, consisted of Mexican youths that were constantly bullied and tormented by white greaser clubs in the area, who were very upset with new Mexican nationals' immigration into a neighborhood that had been Eastern European for decades. If you read Joe Sparks in my book and view the introduction to Chicago gangs on this channel, it briefly covers what occurred. And I will be doing a video on Gaylords and other predominantly white gangs here soon. When the Marshall Boulevard Kings arrived on the scene, the Imperials, Taylor Jousters, and even a group of Latin Counts were already there. These Mexican youth at 24th and Marshall often struggled in schools, such as Harrison High School. Thus, these youth were a great recruiting pool for the Mark Kings. Now, I'm sure the Chicago School District is doing the best it can, but I've always said that education is one of the best ways to keep kids out of gangs and out of the criminal justice system. Like I said, I base all of this history on Latin Kings I've interviewed, talking to cops, and doing research, evidence-based research, which, to be honest, some of which is questionable. It's really only evidence-based if you don't consider some of the biases done in the study and by the writer. By the way, I find it very interesting, having dealt with gangs all of my life, over 60 years now, that many gangs don't even know their own history. You have to understand, many of them never made it past high school. Some never passed junior or middle school, as it is now called. They usually learned about their gang by word of mouth from older gang members who often don't know their own history very well either. You may recall a very telling exercise where one person tells a story, whispers it in the ear of the next person, who then is supposed to tell that same exact story to the next person, and it goes around the room. I've conducted this exercise in classes, and by the time it gets back to the original person and the person next to them tells a story, it sounds nothing close to what was originally said. So imagine what happens in these situations. I'll give you a recent example. There's a video that you can check out on the very popular YouTube channel, Vlad TV, when he interviews King Tone of the Latin Kings. Watch Tone avoid Vlad's questioning about the roots of the Latin Kings. Now, I don't think he was hiding anything. I just don't think he really knew. I'm a big believer in how words don't tell as much as body language and tone, no pun intended. When Vlad questions Tone, he frowns, squirms in his seat, and his voice elevates, as he does throughout the video, spitting venom in four-letter words, and tells Vlad, if he remembers, that he is a New York Latin King, not a Chicago King. I hope to cover the story of the East Coast bloodline in Latin Kings in a future episode that I'm sure will make Tone squirm even more. Anyways, back to my story. The Imperials grew quickly, including Ramon Santos, later known as King Popo, who's Cuban, Jose Cadillac Joe Rivera, Eddie Rodriguez, later known as King Tiger, who's Puerto Rican, Julio Compa Munoz, as well as Joe Gunn, both stated to be Mexican, and Fast Eddie Alvarez. Papa, or Papo King, as he was called both, is seen here in this rare picture. He became a legend with the Latin Kings, as he was said to have started the organization and was often seen out in the streets of Chicago recruiting and politicking for his gang and for his people. Papa was said to have been quite the personality, full of charisma, and he garnered a great deal of respect by his mannerisms. He would often walk down the streets with dozens of Latin Kings following him, so he became kind of a celebrity figure. King Papa was obviously influenced by the Young Lords, who were predominantly Puerto Rican, but also had other Latinos in their group. Both kings and young lords are said to have clashed in the early days before they became more political. On May 15, 1964, it is said that several Puerto Rican gang members from the Imperials, Skulls, and other gangs met in Humboldt Park, not the neighborhood, the actual park. They gathered together because there have been many reports of Puerto Rican and Mexican youth being beat down and bullied by other gangs on the way to school, on the way back, or even going to the corner store. The Latin Kings didn't start until after this May 15, 1964 meeting. But it is stated when the Latin Kings started in 1964, that King Papa Santos insisted on three main principles that the Latin Kings live by: protect our families, protect our neighborhoods, and protect each other. The Kings have always professed to live by this code, and later on, according to laws in their constitution, and are revered almost like a religion that many call Kingism. It is legend that at the May 1964 meeting, Phil of the Skulls and Freddie Rodriguez of the Imperials were co-facilitators of the meeting. And while these two are mentioned, it is possible that Popo was there also. Nobody knows for sure. There are no known pictures, news articles, or even official police intelligence records that I've ever seen, or anybody I know has ever seen, about those meetings. So anything is possible. It is also possible that there could have been multiple meetings that year, a monthly follow-up meeting. Perhaps these happened throughout that summer. A lot of things were happening, including changing neighborhoods. It also just so happens that Chicago and Cook County were reeling from a major sex scandal that broke in April that year that included adults, some of whom were teachers, using and offering marijuana to minors for sex. Legend happens that after the meeting or meetings, King Popo visited a little village to meet with the Markings, Jokers, 23rd Street Boys, and Supreme Cliques. Some residents who lived in there at that time recalled that Ramon King Popo Santos often came into the neighborhoods as he was a natural-born community organizer. It is stated that some of the earliest Latin kings from 24th and Marshall were Scarface, Dino, Don Juan, Black Sal, White Sal, Crazy Man, and Little Boy. It was generally accepted that Don Juan would be the leader of the Boulevard Latin Kings. It is said when the Kings first started in 1964 that they hung out often at a restaurant called Mom and Pop's. Yes, that was the name of it, and it supposedly was owned by a Latino couple who were parents to several kids. This was located right across from Sabin Elementary School. It is said that the restaurant had a jukebox, and after school, Kings would hang out there to eat and talk and flirt, because not only was there Latin Kings, but also Latin Queens in the early days. As the gang grew, Latin Kings were able to convert empty rooms where they had clubhouses, which were often rundown properties that gang members fixed up to hold meetings and parties at. It was here that Latin Kings and Queens would play music, get high, drink, and flirt. I'm sure there were some Latin babies made at some of those events. Often the young men were in families where young males in the entire household kings, but sometimes they had at least one brother who was a member of a different club or gang, as shown here. By the end of 1964, the Latin Kings under King Popo had a very determined expansion plan. The Kings opened up a branch in 1964 at the intersection of Norval and Cortez in the East Village neighborhood. This branch was led by Michael Perez, and the group constantly clashed with the Harrison Gents, as well as the Gaylords. In 1965, Noble and Cortez was left to junior Latin Kings, as the seniors kicked it at Ashland and Cortez. This branch lasted until 1972, when many of the older members moved to Beach and Spalding, when this area was closed. The Kings also began operating at the Winthrop and Ansley area. This area had a lot of Latinos coming in, and many of the youth carved up the neighborhood into gangs. The Kings are first mentioned in a news article in 1965, and as I've stated in previous videos, the media was all over the gangs in the 1950s and 60s. Had there been incidents involving the Kings before 1964, I'm pretty sure it would have been in the newspaper. In the 1965 article, the Kings are clearly called a gang. So basically, after listening to all the stories from cops and gangsters and doing my own research, I feel the Latin Kings organization was created by a combination of factors: discrimination of Latinos by whites, a growing Black and Latino civil rights movement, discussions, and perhaps gang mergers of the Imperials, joining forces with friendly white gangs like the 26th Street Jokers, 23rd Street Boys, and Supreme Cliques, as well as the Latino-based Skulls and Markings. By the late 1960s and 70s, as Latin Kings matured, some of them, especially the Popo Santos faction, became more political. Some even had ties to revolutionary groups. In the same Vlad TV interview that I mentioned, King Tone claims that they were never a gang, but that was just a label the U.S. government put on them. But certainly their rivals in the 1960s and 70s considered them to be a gang, not just law enforcement. Clearly, just like today, not all gang members are the same. Some are very political and socially conscious, and some are very antisocial, even psycho. And so it was back then as it is today. Some Latin Kings are more involved in political activities, like King Tone and Popo Santos, who believe they are there to fight for improvement of their communities, and some were straight thugs. On June 12, 1966, the Division Street riots occurred that involved many young Latino men. It was shared nationally, perhaps even globally. A Puerto Rican man was gunned down by Chicago police. This angered young lords and Latin Kings, who stormed the streets and began to riot. Both the Kings and young lords were mentioned in the media. In the aftermath of the 1966 riots, and after conquest of many other gangs and clubs, the Latin Kings were able to solidify territory in the northern West Humboldt Park intersection at Beach and Spalding, which became their legendary Motherland chapter by 1967. Beach and Spalding opened just as Ohio and Quincy closed, and the governance of Latin Kings was transferred from Leavitt and Schiller to Beach and Spalding. It is said that King Batman was running Beach and Spalding, but King Popo was still in charge overall, and all Latin King sections reported to him. As I stated in previous videos, there was a growing Mexican population in the Pilsen area, so a King's branch was opened up in 1968, and the Kings flipped the Culture Counts gang and converted them into Latin Kings. This occurred at the intersection of Culture and Damon. Pilsen had a lot of different gangs fighting, so the Kings were not able to dominate in that area. In 1969, the Latin Kings migrated into the Logan Square area as Puerto Rican migration expanded throughout Chicago into other neighborhoods. The White Gaylords gang and predominantly Latino-based Imperial Gangsters beefed against the Latin Kings. There is no known Latin King Imperial Gangsters connection. I'm doing an episode on the IG soon, as well as other gangs that I have not covered yet. Often Latin Kings will put up murals or gang graffiti making claim on that territory. If a mural was not defaced, police knew that that was a strong Latin King area, because just like today, one of the biggest acts of disrespect gangs try to do against their enemies is cross them out. As I stated previously, political activism was very popular nationwide in the late 1960s and early 70s. This included Black and brown communities in Chicago. Some Kings at the Levitt and Schiller section in particular began working with a Puerto Rican extremist group called the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional de Puerto Rico, or FALN. It is said that a few Kings even harbored FALN fugitives in this location. I hope to do a full episode on Young Lords, the FALN, and other revolutionary groups in the near future. Once authorities, including the FBI, came after the FLN in full force, Latin Kings cut off their ties with the group, and they had to abandon Levitt and Schiller as the heat was impeding their organization. Latin Kings like Gustavo, Lord Gino Colon, took note of this, and he believed that Papa Santos was taking the organization in the wrong direction. At the same time, drugs became more and more prevalent in Black and brown communities. Some conspiracy advocates even say the feds allowed more drugs to come in. And when you take a look at the government's COINTEL program in events like the Iran-Contra affair, that claim seems to have some merit. Check out 2 books I wrote, How We Lost the War on Drugs, and another book I wrote called Ending Black and Brown Violence in America, for more on that. Since their formation in 1964, Latin Kings have always been involved in the drug trade. However, most of their activity was consisted of buying and smoking marijuana for personal reuse, as well as selling a little grass for some side money, including to protesters who came from all over the country to Chicago, the 1968 Democratic Convention, which became famous as it was broadcast on TV and was very violent. The drug trade really only became a huge part of gangs and street dealers starting in the late 1970s. This was after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, and they expanded to supply the growing numbers of lost and depressed and traumatized military veterans, as well as junkies in the ghettos and barrios who were often disillusioned over Lyndon B. Johnson's promises of the Great Society and the failures of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as well as the assassination of leaders like Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. That concludes Part 1 of Latin Kings. Part 2 will follow shortly.